What is Native Nation rebuilding? Picture this: young people laughing as they play a game in their language, tribal leaders attending the grand opening of a new Indigenous wellness center, entrepreneurs hosting a pop-up event featuring Native-owned businesses. These all sound like hallmarks of a successful Native nation, right? Now, envision a different scenario. A tribal department head selecting his uncle for the job instead of the most qualified candidate. Elders not receiving the culturally specific health resources they need. A tribal council ousting their chairman due to allegations of theft. This nation sounds like it has some issues to resolve. You've likely heard real-life versions of many of these examples, and you've probably noticed that some Native nations are more successful than others. But have you ever stopped to truly consider why? This question inspired the researchers from the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, who originally created the Native Nation Rebuilding Framework. They analyzed a huge volume of data and case studies, eventually pinpointing 5 specific factors that lead to Native nations thriving on their own terms. The Rebuilding Framework provides guidance for both internal governance and external relationships through 5 interconnected principles. In order for Native nations to see results, the principles all need to exist at the same time. Let's explore the principles themselves and what they mean. Up first is transformational leadership. This means a nation's leaders serve as visionaries, change makers, and mobilizers. Next is strong governing institutions. Essentially, this looks like a nation having systems, laws, and policies that are effective, clear, and fair. Nations with strong governing institutions also have mechanisms for adjusting systems that aren't working. We must consider the future, and that's where 7th generation thinking comes into play. This principle says that a nation's decision-making is strategic and long-term. Culture lies at the heart of who we are. The principle of cultural match is defined by the creation of systems that reflect Indigenous culture and values. And lastly, we can't forget about sovereignty, or a nation's ability to design and create its own future. You might be wondering, why is this framework referred to as rebuilding? The term rebuilding honors the fact that Native people and nations already have the tools they need to succeed. The rebuilding framework simply puts these tools into a common language. At its core, rebuilding is about using Indigenous knowledge and values to solve modern-day problems in a way that makes sense to that particular nation. One important note before we go: it's essential to differentiate between Native Nation rebuilding approach and the standard approach. The standard approach refers to an unstrategic, unempowered, rushed, and oftentimes unfair way of solving problems. Think back to the example we gave earlier about the tribal department head who chose his uncle for the job instead of the most qualified candidate. This is a perfect example of the standard approach. Alternatively, using the Native Nation rebuilding approach here would look like a nation developing a fair, transparent hiring process and ensuring that everyone in charge of hiring follows it. On the path to rebuilding, it's easy to default back to the standard approach because it feels known and comfortable. Changemakers working to implement Native Nation rebuilding can draw upon their community's inherent strengths to overcome the standard approach and design a future that reflects Indigenous innovation and wisdom. To learn more about Native Nation rebuilding and how to get started, visit nativegov.org.